Over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, the Viking Age was fully aflame across northwestern Europe. While the Danes assailed England and France, Norse attacks made Ireland an almost perpetual battleground. Vikings seized control of ports such as Dublin, Limerick and Wexford, where they established powerful strongholds and thriving trading hubs. Slavery was the biggest business, and the Norse scoured Ireland for captives to supply their trade. In response, Ireland's kings grew more militant, her various clans more united under the High King, who would take the fight to the Vikings. The Norse had the speed of their longships, but the Irish had the advantage of surprise and ambush. Today on Real Crusades History, we'll explore the complete history of Ireland's Viking Age, from the first raid on Rathlin Island in 795 to the epic Battle of Clontarf in 1014, in which Ireland's celebrated High King Brian Boru faced the forces of the Norse King of Dublin, Sigtryg Silkbeard. Join us. Historian John Haywood famously wrote that few places suffered more at the hands of the Vikings than Ireland. For around 2 centuries, Norse raiders carried away untold numbers of Irish men, women and children to supply their slave trade. Though Vikings managed to establish a few long-term strongholds on the Irish coast, they never conquered any major stretches of territory. In part, this was due to the nature of political power in Ireland. Ireland was perhaps the most divided region in early medieval Europe. There existed on the island some 150 small kingdoms and around a dozen over-kingdoms. These kingdoms, called tuatha, were peoples more than territories, extended kin groups or clans. At the head stood the king, a man of senior lineage responsible for the prosperity and safety of his people. The king had a role as lawmaker, judge, and military commander. Wealth was measured in livestock and land to be protected by the king. Free families owed the king tribute of livestock and crops, as well as military service. Kings of smaller clans might also owe tribute to the overking, who in turn could owe the same to the High King, or ríomhaireach. The true power of an overking lay in his ability to command the loyalty of client kings. The chain of loyalty among kingdoms was never permanent. A capable, ambitious king could make himself an overking by building a strong confederation of clans, but he could easily lose it all to another enterprising warrior chieftain. Nevertheless, by the 8th century, some fairly resilient confederations had emerged. The most powerful were the northern Nael clan, which dominated northeast Ulster, and the southern Nael, which dominated Meath. This lack of centralised authority and vigorous warlike competition among clans created enormous problems for Vikings bent on permanent conquest. The Vikings targeting Ireland were mainly of Norwegian origin. They descended upon Ireland via the Northern Isles and the Hebrides. 795 is the year of the first recorded Norse raid in Ireland, when Vikings sacked the monastery at Wrecsam, modern Rathlin Island. In 798, Norsemen struck St. Patrick's Island, seizing cattle and destroying the shrine of Dochana. By the 830s, fleets of some 50 or 60 ships arrived for more systematic attacks. The Norse shunned Ireland's rugged, mountainous western coastline, preferring instead to target the more populous and wealthier eastern coast. They began using Ireland's rivers, such as the Shannon, to plunder the island's numerous wealthy monasteries. Ireland was the cradle of Christianity in the British Isles. The island had been Christian since the 5th century, and it was Irish monks who had spread the faith across northern Britain. For centuries, Irish monasteries flourished, surrounded by prosperous towns and villages. One 7th century chronicler wrote this of the community that had sprung up around the monastery of Kildare.
No man need fear any mortal adversary or any gathering of enemies, and who could number the varieties of people who gather there in countless throngs from all provinces. Some come for the abundance of its feasts, others in ill health come for a cure, others come simply to watch the crowds go by.
Those words were written before the dawn of Ireland's Viking Age. Local Irish communities did not shy from a fight, but due to the speed of Norse ships, Vikings often escaped before a force could assemble to oppose them. Terror gripped the monks within their monasteries, who prayed for storms to drive the Norsemen from the seas. In the margins of a commentary on Latin grammar, one 9th century monk of the monastery of St. Gall wrote,
"The wind is fierce tonight, it tosses the sea's white hair. I fear no wild Viking crossing the main."
But soon, the Vikings no longer came merely as raiders, but as conquerors. In 839, a fleet led by the warlord Thorgil the Devil, called Turgesius by the Irish, struck up the River Bann into Lough Neagh. Rather than plunder and depart, Thorgil established a fortified camp on the shore of the lake. Here the Norsemen remained for 3 years, plundering the heart of Ulster each summer. This was the first Viking shore base ever established. The Irish called them longforts. The Norse established a permanent presence in Ireland. This allowed them to expand their raiding operations, but it also robbed them of their mobility. These forts were vulnerable to attack. In 840, Thorgil the Devil plundered the important monastery of St. Patrick at Armagh in Northern Ireland. Here was the very centre of Ireland's spiritual life, the site of St. Patrick's death and burial. Over the years, the location had evolved into a great complex of schools, monastic communities and markets. Many Irish kings stored their royal treasuries at St. Patrick's, hoping the saint would guard over their wealth. Monasteries in general were repositories of precious objects. As legal centres, items used in pledges, such as brooches, were kept within their walls, as well as many sacred objects like altar vessels, book covers, and reliquaries. Thorgil's attack was devastating and solidified his reputation among the Irish as the most devilish of Norse chieftains. According to the sources, Thorgil personally led the assault, cutting down monks and students. His Vikings smashed the altars, broke open the tombs and reliquaries. We are told that Thorgil himself even performed a sacrifice to Odin on what remained of the high altar in the cathedral. The loot gained was so immense that Thorgil returned twice in the same year. After his final attack, he burned the monastery to the ground. Thorgil the Devil was unlike any of Ireland's previous Viking raiders. Lars Brownworth speculates that his aim was nothing less than the conquest of the entire island. In 841, on the east coast of Ireland, he established a longfort at a defensible location with an excellent bay. The site was known to locals as the Black Pools, Dublin. Thorgil enclosed his fortress with a thick earthen wall topped with wooden palisades. Next, he led his fleet up the Shannon in 844 to Lough Ree, where he raised another longfort. From here, he launched extensive raids across the Great Midlands. But in 845, Thorgil was killed by Máel Sechnaill, the Irish king of Meath. We're not sure how this happened, but the Welsh churchman Gerald of Wales, writing centuries later, weaves a fantastic tale on the matter. Gerard states that Thorgil sent a message to Máel Sechnaill demanding the hand of his daughter in marriage. Máel Sechnaill agreed, but instead sent a band of beardless youths disguised as his daughter and her maidservants. When the bride-to-be and her companions were brought before Thorgil, the youths threw off their disguises and slew the Viking chieftain and his warriors. More Irish victories followed. The Annals of Ulster describe 4 battles in the year 848, in which Irish armies defeated the Vikings, who suffered enormous casualties. Irish warriors rarely bothered to take prisoners, preferring instead to collect enemy heads, an ancient Celtic custom. In 849, Máel Sechnaill captured and sacked Dublin. This caused many of the Norse settlers to depart in search of easier plunder. However, things would change again in 853, when 2 Norwegian brothers, Olaf and Ivar, arrived in Dublin with their own fleet. Together, these brothers would secure Dublin for the Norwegians and establish the Viking Kingdom of Dublin. The Viking Age in Ireland was far from over.
'853 was the next decisive year in the history of Ireland's Viking Age. That year, two Norwegian brothers, Ivar and Olaf, seized control of Dublin, expelling the Danes. Together, the brothers became joint kings of Dublin, transforming it from a raiding outpost to a proper power centre. Traditionally, Ivar has been identified with the legendary Ivar the Boneless, son of that most famous and elusive Viking Ragnar Lodbrok. Ragnar's very existence is questioned by most historians. John Haywood calls attempts to identify Ivar with Ivar the Boneless unconvincing. Lars Brownworth says that, unlike Thorgil the Devil, Ivar and Olaf weren't interested in subduing all of Ireland. Instead, they wanted to establish Dublin as a trading base and a springboard for raids throughout the British Isles. The small Irish kingdoms that dotted the interior of the island were too warlike and numerous for the Norsemen to conquer. But from the coast, a Viking kingdom could be defended and enriched. Dublin became one of the most prosperous ports in the early medieval West. It was well connected with the trading hubs of Norway, England, and the Frankish territories, and was a prime stopping point for Vikings setting out for the North Atlantic. The long ports of Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, and Cork also grew busier and wealthier. Olaf and Ivar sought to take advantage of political divisions within Ireland. They forged an alliance with Cerbhal mac Dúnlaoghaire, King of Osraige in southeastern Ireland, against the High King Máel Sechnaill. The history during this period isn't as simple as Irish versus Vikings. Some Vikings made alliances with some Irish. Vikings battled Vikings. Irish battled Irish. It wasn't uncommon for two opposing sides to contain both Irish and Vikings, or even the offspring of Viking and Irish unions. On that note, the alliance between the King of Osraige and the Vikings of Dublin was sealed by a marriage pact. Olaf may have married one of Cerbhal's daughters. He was likely baptized first, though the Norse were known to accept baptism for political reasons without genuinely adopting the Christian faith. After campaigning together for a season, Cerbhal, Olaf, and Ivar invaded Máel Sechnaill's kingdom of Meath in 859. However, Cerbhal quickly came to terms with the King of Meath and abandoned his Norse allies. Olaf and Ivar turned to another Irish king, Eyfindleath, the northern Ichneil king of Ulster. After Máel Sechnaill's death in 862, Olaf and Ivar broke with Ey to support Lorcan mac Cathal, Máel Sechnaill's successor. However, Lorcan would live to regret his association with the Norse. In 863, Olaf and Ivar committed an act of near sacrilege on revered Irish ground. The two brothers plundered the Neolithic burial mounds of Noth on the River Boyne, seeking treasure. This sparked rage across Ireland. King Ey was quick to castigate his rival Lorcan as an ally of grave robbers. In 864, Ey captured and blinded Lorcan, forcing him to abdicate. Having run out of Irish allies, Olaf and Ivar launched a raid across the Irish Sea to Scotland. Eyfindleath was now High King. He took this opportunity to plunder and wipe out the Norse longfort at Ulster. He defeated the Norse in battle at Loch Foyle and carried home 240 enemy heads. Then Eyd's ally, King Kensig of Loegis, attacked and destroyed Olaf's frontier fortress of Clondalkin, a mere 5 miles from Dublin itself. All these events demonstrated the vulnerabilities of the Norse coastal kingdom when faced with a motivated and powerful High King. Hoping to recover from these setbacks, Olaf struck an alliance with the southern Ichneil and Leinster. A decisively defeated this alliance at the Battle of Killinere on September 6, 868, just 3 years before Alfred the Great and his brother Ethelred won their first great victory against the Vikings in England at Ashdown. Among the dead, one of Olaf's own sons. Olaf vowed revenge. In 869, he launched a massive raid against Armagh, sacking the town and shrine complex and leading away some 1,000 captives. It was a devastating blow to King A, the monastery's supposed protector. Their coffers bursting with loot, Olaf and Ivar launched more raids across the Irish Sea. They plundered Strathclyde 2 years in a row, returning with many captives. In 872, Olaf and Ivar again plundered the lands of their old enemy, the King of Meath. But in 873, Ivar took ill and died. By 875, Olaf too was dead, slain in battle with King Constantine I of Scotland. Lacking strong leadership, Norse Dublin grew politically volatile. Once again, Danish Vikings challenged the Norwegians for control of the town. Halfdan, ruler of York, and one of the commanders of the great heathen army that terrorized England, seems to have seized and ruled Dublin for a time. The Irish themselves distinguished between Danish and Norwegian Scandinavians. The Danes they called the Dark Heathens, while the Norwegians they called the Fair Heathens. Once more, the Norwegians allied with Eyfindliath, who defeated Halfdan and placed one of Ivar's sons on the Dublin throne. But after a series of ineffectual kings, Dublin faced a renewed Irish challenge in 902. Cerbhal mac Muirchearn, king of Leinster, and Máel Finnea, king of Berga, led their armies in a pincer assault from the north and south. There was a fierce battle. The Vikings made a desperate stand, but the Irish triumphed. The Norse fled on their ships, most of them taking refuge in the Danelaw of England, that is, Danish-ruled portions of England. It was a monumental victory for the Irish. Viking rule in Dublin was ended, for now. So concluded Ireland's first Viking Age. The Irish abandoned or destroyed most of the Norse longforts. However, Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick endured as permanent towns. All enjoyed the benefit of a good harbour. Traces of the original Viking longport at Dublin have been found. Norse burial sites, ship rivets, and even the remains of a defensive rampart. The original site may have been close to Dublin Castle, near the Dublin, the Black Pool, from which the city takes its English name. After the Vikings were defeated at the end of the 9th century, Dublin continued to expand. There's no question that the Norse mostly fled from Ireland during this time, so there must have already been a robust Irish population in Dublin throughout the first Viking period. The most important change brought by the Vikings was trade. Before the Norse, Dublin had not been a trading town, nor had coinage been widespread. It was the seafaring Vikings who connected Dublin to trading hubs at York and Dorestad. But pre-Viking Ireland was far from poor. Hoards of gold and silver religious vessels demonstrate the wealth of early medieval Irish monasteries. Monasteries were more than just communities of monks. Towns sprang up around them, and kings, seeking the protection of saints and their relics, established residences at the more important monastic sites. However, it wasn't gold or silver that most attracted Viking raiders. It was the Irish themselves. Early medieval Ireland was home to a robust and generally well-nourished population. Around 500,000 people dwelt in Ireland at the start of the 9th century. Mild winters, cool summers, and consistent rainfall allowed grass to grow year-round, so cattle and sheep could graze through the winter. Few people suffered from serious poverty. Occasionally, cattle epidemics caused famine, but these were rare. Meat was readily available. Prior to the arrival of the Vikings, warfare did not involve the selling of captives into slavery. Plunder usually amounted to the theft of livestock. But the Norse elevated the suffering and human tragedy of warfare with their relentless appetite for slaves. As the Vikings became just one more power player among the Irish kingdoms, Irish kings themselves began selling their prisoners of war to Viking slave traders. The early medieval slave market was big business, and the Vikings, who travelled widely in their outstanding ships, were perhaps the most enterprising slave traders of the era. The lucky captives were ransomed by their relatives, but those who couldn't be ransomed were sold abroad. Anglo-Saxon England and the Frankish kingdoms both had active slave trades, but the Vikings generally preferred the higher prices they could obtain in the wealthy Byzantine Empire and Arab caliphates. Most Irish captives likely ended up either in Scandinavia itself or in the opulent cities of Muslim Spain or North Africa. John Haywood questions the standard idea that the Vikings benefited Ireland by opening it up to the wider trade markets of the medieval world. It's true that the Vikings brought many new markets into Ireland, but considering that slavery was the biggest business introduced by the Norse, as Haywood puts it, it's unlikely that the victims of the slave trade were quite so sanguine about the benefits of Viking commerce. Source materials provide little detail concerning the fates of the victims of the Viking slave trade. However, two incredible accounts survive concerning men captured by Viking slavers. The first is an account of the life of Saint Findan. In the mid-9th century, Findan's sister was captured by Norse raiders. Findan's father sent his son to meet with the Vikings to negotiate a ransom. However, as soon as Findan arrived, the Vikings seized and enslaved him as well. He was held in chains on the Norsemen's ship for 2 days without food or water. Finally, the Vikings determined that it was bad business to capture someone offering to pay a ransom, since this might discourage others from doing the same. The Vikings released Findan and his sister. A short time later, Findan found himself again at a location suffering a Viking attack, but the saint hid behind the door of a hut. Demonstrating the frequency of Norse raids in 9th century Ireland, Findan was unlucky enough to be captured in a third encounter with Vikings. This time, he was sold into slavery. After being sold and resold a few times, Findan found himself on a ship bound for Scandinavia. During an encounter with pirates, Findan helped the crew fight off their attackers. As a reward, the captain removed the slaves' leg irons. During a stopover in Orkney, Findan jumped ship and made good his escape. After a long journey, the Irish saint made it to Rome. At last, he ended his days as a monk in a monastery in Switzerland, where a fellow monk recorded his life shortly after his death. The second account is a bit more entertaining. Morchad, a family man with a wife and daughter, was captured by Vikings and taken to Northumbria. Here, the Norse slavers sold him to a nunnery, but the clever Morchad ended up seducing many of the nuns who'd purchased him. When the locals realized that a slave had brought shame upon the nunnery, they banished Morchad, casting him adrift on a boat without oars as punishment for his transgressions. Fortunately, Morchad was rescued by Vikings passing by in their ship. The Vikings traveled to Germany, where they sold Morchad to a wealthy widow. Apparently, he was a bit of a ladies' man, for he seduced this widow as well. Morchad's adventures continued. He made it back to Ireland and was reunited with his family. He ended his days working as a teacher of Latin grammar. It's difficult to know how much history is contained in these stories. John Haywood notes that many slaves probably weren't as lucky as Findan and Morchad. However, escape probably wasn't all that uncommon, and many slaves were eventually freed. Thousands of Irish brought as slaves to Iceland were later freed and became tenant farmers. By the dawn of the 10th century, Scandinavian adventurers had subdued and ruled substantial portions of England, Scotland, and France. However, they'd been driven out of Ireland. It was the centralized rule of the main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England that allowed the Norse to conquer and rule substantial territories. Defeat the king and his army and you're the new power. In Ireland, there were far too many small units of power for the Vikings to gain a substantial hold across broad stretches of land. Often it was tricky to even strike a peace treaty. peace with one Irish chieftain didn't guarantee peace with another. We shouldn't dismiss the fighting prowess of the medieval Irish. Many small-time kings could raise a force of around 300. This was enough to deal with a small Viking raiding party. Cooperation among several Irish kings could produce substantial armies. However, most Norse raiders were better equipped than their Irish opponents. A Viking of reasonable means equipped himself with a mail shirt and iron helmet. The Irish often lacked both and were armed only with spears and small round shields called bucklers. To overcome this disadvantage, the Irish favoured ambush and hit-and-run attacks rather than open battle. When assaulting a Viking raiding party as it travelled through the Irish countryside, the lightly armed Irish were at an advantage. They could strike suddenly and overwhelm the Norse, then melt away into the surrounding wilderness. A successful raid left a Norse contingent vulnerable, for they were tired and loaded down with captives and loot. It was common for the Irish to track and strike battle-weary Viking raiders as they laboured to pack up and haul off their plunder. Across Ireland, man-made structures provided little adequate defence against Norse attacks. Tens of thousands of small forts, called ring forts, were scattered across Ireland. Over-kings had fairly substantial stone strongholds, such as the Grinan of Ailech of Donegal, the main base of the northern Ineal. This fortress had stone walls 15 feet high, which contained an area of around 75 feet in diameter. Smaller time kings had simpler forts, secured with an earthen wall and palisades, and measuring as little as 30 feet in diameter. Such structures contained little more than the chief's residence and a few small buildings. For some 40 years, Ireland was mostly free of Viking raids. During that period, the Norse were intensely active in England and France. But by the early 10th century, the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks were increasingly victorious in their efforts against the feared Northmen. Once more, Ireland tempted enterprising Viking commanders. Interestingly, Ireland's second Viking age began with a battle between competing Norse chieftains. In 914, Ragnald, a grandson of Ivar, the one-time king of Dublin, defeated a rival Viking commander in a sea battle off the coast of the Isle of Man. Ragnald then established a longport at Waterford on the southeastern end of Ireland. The Norse were back. Ireland's second Viking age had begun. In 917, Ragnald's brother Sihtric One-Eyed seized Dublin. This was an alarming development to Ireland's kings. The High King, Niall Glundubh, assembled a coalition to drive the Vikings from Dublin once more. The annals of the Four Masters record the High King as making the following speech on the morning of the battle. "Whoever wishes for a speckled boss, and a sword of sore-inflicting wounds, and a green javelin for wounding wretches, let him go early in the morning to Auclair." However, the Battle of Island Bridge would prove a decisive victory for Sihtric One-Eyed. During this battle, 6 Irish kings were killed, including the High King, Niall Glundubh, himself. Lars Brownworth calls it the greatest defeat ever inflicted on the Irish by the Norse. The victory ensured that Dublin would remain a Viking stronghold. But war would continue. Over the next several years, the Norse continued to re-establish their presence across Ireland's coastal towns. In 922, Thorir Helgason re-established the Viking Jarldom of Limerick, and the Norse took Cork and Wexford. As in Ireland's first Viking age, the Northmen didn't attempt any large-scale conquests, but focused on holding small but heavily fortified coastal bases. Dublin dominated the largest region known as Dublinshire, which stretched along the coast from Wicklow in the south to Skerries in the north, and as far inland as Leixlip, Salmon Leap in Old Norse, at the River Liffey. But the Vikings didn't settle beyond Dublin and its immediate surroundings. The ever-practical and ruthless Sihtric shunned Ireland's interior. In a classically Scandinavian outlook, Sihtric saw the world as a series of points on the sea rather than a collection of land masses. As Lars Brownworth points out, the Vikings could cross the sea easily and rule a single kingdom that included ports in England and Ireland. With Dublin secured, Sihtric left his Irish realm in the hands of his cousin Guthfrith and sailed to York. York had already been ruled by Sihtric's brother Ragnald, and he regarded it as a family possession. There, Sihtric was accepted as king. Sihtric spent the next 6 years expanding and consolidating Viking rule across Northumbria. Meanwhile, Guthfrith ruled Dublin with an iron fist. He at once launched extensive slave raids across Ireland. In November of 921, he sacked Armagh. Curiously, Guthfrith spared the monastic buildings and the monks themselves. Could Guthfrith have been a Christian convert? We're not sure. Whatever the case, Guthfrith suffered the classic fate of victorious Viking chieftains. As he was travelling home, loaded with plunder, Guthfrith was ambushed by Miechtach of the Leather Cloaks of the northern Ynjel. It was a disaster for the Vikings. During the battle, Miechtach lost his life, but his men were victorious. Guthfrith was heavily defeated. This marked a turning point in Ireland's second Viking age. Unlike the first age, the Vikings could not crisscross Ireland without meeting serious opposition. Now, the Irish were better adapted to Viking tactics and had even adopted some of them themselves. From now on, Irish armies would pose a great danger to Viking raiding expeditions.
I hope you're enjoying this documentary. I'd like to take a break to invite you to support my work by signing up on my Patreon, or by becoming a member here on YouTube, or by picking up a copy of my historical novel, Why Does the Heathen Rage? You'll find links to my Patreon and my book in the description down below. I need your support to continue to do this important work, so if you enjoy it, I do hope you'll consider signing up. Thank you, and let's get back to the documentary.
Miechtach of the Leather Cloaks won another victory against the Dublin Norse at the Battle of Carlingford Lough in 925, after which 200 Vikings were captured and beheaded. The following year, Miechtach slew Guthfrey's son Halfdan in battle and besieged the Longfort at Lingduchel. The Norse defenders were only saved when Guthfrey himself arrived with a relieving force, and Miechtach's army withdrew. Guthfrey determined that Lingduchel could no longer be defended and abandoned the Longfort. A century of Viking raids had changed Irish society. The Irish clans were more militaristic. Kings who gained success against the Vikings won the loyalty of their fellow kings. The power of the over-kings became more formalised and territorial. Sub-kings increasingly resembled territorial lords for the over-kings, and the Irish were adopting Viking tactics and weapons. Swords and axes gained popularity among Irish warriors. Burning and plundering had been mostly unknown in Irish warfare prior to the arrival of the Vikings. But now, the Irish adopted this tactic, even turning it on the Norse themselves. But the Irish kings also employed this more aggressive method of warfare against each other. In 927, Sihtric One-Eyed died. His kinsman, Guthfrey, travelled to York to claim the seat of his ancestral kingdom. However, things had changed in England, where the Anglo-Saxons were ascendant. Alfred the Great's grandson, King Ethelstan, was consolidating his rule over much of England, including the old Danelaw of the Vikings. Ethelstan defeated and expelled Guthfrey. York was now lost to the Dublin Vikings. The sea-straddling kingdom was unravelling. Returning to Dublin, Guthfrey ruled there until his death in 934. Guthfrey's son, Olaf Guthruson, had to battle other Vikings for the right to rule Dublin. He defeated the Limerick Vikings in a battle at Loughrea in 937. Olaf was now the supreme Viking king in Ireland. Emboldened by this success, he plotted to recapture the wealthy port of York and reconstruct his father's kingdom. Olaf struck an alliance with Constantine I, King of Scotland, and the Welsh King Owen of Strathclyde, and prepared to invade England. Max Adam notes, the fleet Olaf assembled was strikingly large for the period. Adams concludes that Olaf's army must have been unusually large for the 10th century, perhaps containing around 8,000 men. Along with his Scottish and Welsh allies, Olaf must have commanded a force of some 10 or 12,000. Clearly, the Dublin Vikings could call on immense resources to launch such an ambitious expedition. Olaf fully intended to reverse the victories of Alfred the Great's dynasty in England. Many historians cite Aethelstan as the true founder of the Kingdom of England. Educated by his aunt, the formidable daughter of Alfred the Great, Lady Ethelfled of Mercia, and schooled in battle alongside his father, King Edward the Elder, Aethelstan sprung from a proud lineage. Alone among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, his House of Wessex had survived and ultimately defeated the Vikings. But Aethelstan was more than a warrior king. Like Alfred the Great, he was devoted to the law, and more legal texts survived from Aethelstan's reign than from any other 10th century English king. Now Aethelstan was about to face a Viking attack as perilous as those confronted by his grandfather. In the summer of 937, Aethelstan was with his army campaigning in the south of England when he heard that Olaf Guthridsson, king of the Dublin Vikings, was at the head of a coalition army, ravaging Mercia. Given the size of the Norse coalition, the stakes could not have been higher. Olaf's forces were able to spread chaos and destruction across a wide swathe of territory. William of Malmesbury writes of continuous ravages, driving out the people, setting fire to the fields. Aethelstan needed to act immediately. Joined by his brother Edmund, Aethelstan led a large army north, intent on countering Olaf's attack. The two armies met at Brunanburh. Thus began one of the most legendary battles of the Viking Age, immortalised in the Annals of Ulster and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Poised opposite one another, the two armies advanced, arrayed in the shield wall formation typical of this period. Fighting lasted all day. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle leaves a vivid and stirring account of the event.
In this year King Aethelstan, Lord of Nobles, dispenser of treasure to men, and his brother also, Edmund Atheling, won by the sword's edge undying glory in battle round Brunanburh. Edward's sons clove the shield wall, hewed the lindenwood shields with hammered swords. Their enemies perished. The people of the Scots and the Northmen fell doomed. The field grew dark with the blood of men from the time when the sun, that glorious luminary, the bright candle of God, of the Lord Eternal, moved over the earth in the hours of the morning, until that noble creation sank at its setting. There lay many a man destroyed by the spears, many a northern warrior shot over his shield, and likewise many a Scot lay weary, sated with battle.
The clash was fierce. Both sides endured serious casualties. But the Anglo-Saxons won the day. Olaf's coalition collapsed. The Annals of Ulster offer a brief but powerful account of the battle. A great, lamentable and horrible battle was cruelly fought between the Saxons and the Norsemen, in which several thousands of the Norsemen, who are uncounted, fell. But their king Olaf escaped with a few followers. A large number of Saxons fell on the other side, but Aethelstan, king of the Saxons, enjoyed a great victory. The Anglo-Saxon victory at Brunanburh greatly impacted Ireland. Mahertach of the Leather Cloaks took advantage of Olaf's defeat, sacking Dublin in 938. However, when Aethelstan died in 939, Olaf tried again to restore his family's sea kingdom. For a time, he managed to seize and rule York, but he died soon after in 941. Despite Olaf's restoration, Norse rule in York was never again secure, with the powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom an ever-present threat. With Olaf dead, his cousin Olaf Sitricsson became King of York. His brother, Blokra Guthruson, became King of Dublin. Blokra proved a fierce commander. To counter Blokra's raiding, Mahertug of the Leather Cloaks rallied an Irish army against the Norse at Glas Liahan. In the ensuing battle, the Vikings triumphed, and King Mahertug was killed. 5 days later, Blokra sacked Armagh. The Irish mourned Mahertug's death. He'd been a successful and valiant king, who often prevailed over the Norse. The annals of Ulster call him the Hector of the West, and lament that his death had left the land of the Irish orphaned. Mahertug's death rallied the Irish together, eager to honour the king of Aileach's heroic sacrifice. In 944, Congalach Cnoba became High King of Ireland and swiftly set about avenging recent Norse victories. He invaded and sacked Dublin, inflicting hundreds of casualties on the Norse. The disaster for the Vikings was so serious that Blokra fled into exile. The Norse failed to hold out at York, and the English defeated and drove out Olaf Sitricsson, who fled to Dublin. Olaf took power in Dublin, but he died in battle with Congalach in 948. Another of Sitric one-eyed sons, Godfred, became the new king of Dublin. As usual, Godfred opened his reign with extensive raids. He plundered the Irish Midlands in 951, looting some dozen Irish monasteries, including Kells. The annals of Ulster say that 3,000 men were taken as captives to Dublin, as well as immense hauls of cattle, horses, gold and silver. However, the annals report with satisfaction that divine judgment followed. Epidemics of dysentery and leprosy spread throughout Dublin. King Godfred was among the dead.
It became increasingly clear that the Vikings of Ireland were entering what Lars Brownworth calls a period of relative weakness. This attracted the attention of other enterprising Norsemen interested in York. One of these was Eric Bloodaxe of Norway, an iconic figure of the Viking Age. One of some 20 sons of Norway's first king, Harald Fairhair, Eric proved a natural warrior and conqueror. At age 12, he left home for a decade of raiding from France to the Baltic coast. King Harald relished in Eric's courage and declared him his heir. This wasn't well received by Eric's many older brothers. Violence ensued, and Eric murdered 2 of his brothers with an axe. When 2 other brothers contested their father's will, Eric brutally subdued this challenge as well. All this fratricide may have earned Eric the moniker Bloodaxe, though some argue the nickname didn't appear until the 12th century. Eric became King of Norway, but his rule proved brief. He governed with the same ruthlessness that had gained him his crown. One of Eric's surviving brothers, Hakon the Good, gained the support of the commoners and the Jarls, seized the throne, and drove Bloodaxe into exile. But Eric didn't despair at his misfortune. He easily resumed a career in plunder and pillage. As his success grew, he acquired a following and managed to gain the crown of York. However, Eadred, the new Anglo-Saxon king of England, vowed to eliminate Norse rule in York once and for all. With Eadred's blessing, the Scots raided Northumbria. Meanwhile, the English king marched north with his army, promising to punish the Northumbrians should they fail to expel Bloodaxe. This worked. The Northumbrians chased Eric and his entourage straight out of England. Eric Bloodaxe would prove to be the final independent Norse king of York. By 955, the Kingdom of England had permanently absorbed York and the territories that had comprised the Danelaw. The Danelaw, occasionally joined to Viking Dublin, had endured some 100 years. the image of a sword on a silver penny struck during one of Eric Bloodaxe's brief, violent reigns, fittingly commemorates York's Viking era. The dream of a Viking sea kingdom joining Dublin and York died at last. It was always a long shot. Sailing from Dublin to York via the North Sea involved a perilous sea voyage. Keeping both the English and the Irish at bay challenged even the most seasoned Viking chieftain. Unlike most of Dublin's previous Norse rulers, Olaf Sitriksson shunned regular raids. Instead, he focused on navigating the turbulent politics of Ireland's competing kings. Through marriage, Olaf bound himself to Ireland's warrior aristocracies. Indeed, Olaf was technically a Christian. He'd accepted baptism as part of a treaty with King Edmund of England, brother of the famous Aethelstan. First, Olaf married Dunlaith, sister of the High King Domnall Niall, who reigned from 956 to 980. After Dunlaith's death, he married Gormflaith, daughter of the King of Leinster, Murchad mac Fin. Throughout his reign, Olaf struggled with his father-in-law, the High King Domnall, and various Leinster kings. After Domnall died, Dunlaith's son from a prior marriage, Maelshecnal mac Domnall, became High King in 980. Maelshecnal felt little love for the Dublin Vikings. In 975, he burned a sacred grove dedicated to Thor outside the town. Olaf wanted to check the power of the new High King. In 980, he raised a coalition including Viking forces from the Scottish coast and the Hebrides. Maelshecnal's own forces joined Irish troops from Leinster and Ulster. The two sides met at the Hill of Tara, an ancient burial mound, the site of the Stone of Power and the traditional seat of Ireland's High Kings. The Battle of Tara ended in a decisive victory for Maelshecnal and a crushing defeat for Olaf. This battle, and not the later Clontarf, proved the decisive defeat of the Norse in Ireland. Olaf's eldest son and heir died in the fray, and the Viking army dissolved. Pressing his advantage, Maelshecnal besieged Dublin. After 3 days, Olaf's capital surrendered. Maelshecnal extracted a hefty tribute from the citizens, while Olaf fled into exile. But Olaf didn't flee to a neighbouring Viking stronghold. Instead, he became a monk at Iona, where he died. Largely gone were the days when Norse raiders like Thorgil the Devil defaced monasteries. Now the Irish Norse existed within the political, cultural, and even religious frameworks of Ireland, so much so that a defeated Dublin Viking ended his days at a Gaelic monastery. Once more an Irish king ruled Dublin, but this time he'd taken it from an at least nominally Christian Norse ruler, related by marriage to Ireland's leading dynasties. Indeed, Maelshecnal appointed as his vassal to rule for him in Dublin Olaf's own son by Dunlaith, Yarna Ionni. Yarna, the High King's half-brother, embodied the melding of all things Norse and Irish. His father had been a prestigious Viking adventurer and conqueror. His mother was the daughter of an Irish High King. Was this how Ireland's second Viking Age would end, with invader and invaded coalescing? Whatever the case, Maelshecnal's victory at the Battle of Tara ended Dublin's run as a dominant, independent power. From this point on, the Norse no longer exercised independent power on the island. Instead, they jockeyed amid Ireland's feuding kings. The days when fierce warlords like Thorgil the Devil seemed liable to overrun all of Ireland were long gone. The verdict of Tara solidified Maelshecnal as Ireland's most important ruler. Meath now firmly wielded the office of High King. One somewhat troubling peripheral threat annoyed the Meath dynasty: the kings of Munster, based in the rural southwest. Word was spreading that Munster's royal house had a knack for defeating Vikings. The close of Ireland's Viking Age is generally associated with the greatest king of the Munster dynasty, Brian Boru, who reigned from 978 to 1014. Brian's life and career swelled to legendary status in Irish consciousness. Brian Boru's rise to power starts like a good epic. A younger son, Brian likely never expected to become king.
He was one of 12 sons, born to a dynasty of second-rate minor kings. Monks of a Munster monastery educated the young Brian. He learned to play the harp. Years later, the Irish would adopt the harp as their national symbol in Brian's honour. Irish monasteries were in no way crude institutions, and Brian learned both Greek and Latin. He particularly cherished the writings of Julius Caesar, his favourite general. He relished Caesar's ability to unbalance his enemies, and his practice of memorising battle plans to safeguard them from spies. Brian's older brother, Mathgaman, assumed the throne of their father, Kensig mac Lorcan, king of the Dalgash. Their kingdom contained roughly the modern County Clare and owed tribute to the throne of Munster. Early in life, Brian learned about war alongside Mathgaman. In 967, Brian and his brother fought Ivar and the Limerick Vikings at the Battle of Sulcott. The Dalgash triumphed and ended Ivar's expansion. The next year, Mathgaman and Brian captured and sacked Limerick itself, executing all fighting-age males. All other captives they sold into slavery. Ivar fled to Britain but returned with the fleet in 969 and recaptured Limerick. At last, the Dalgash defeated Ivar once more in 972, regaining Limerick in the process. Between these two showdowns with the Limerick Vikings, Brian's family achieved a crucial advance. Around 970, Mathgaman defeated his overlord, Maelmwad, king of Munster, and took the key stronghold of Cashel Rock. Cashel is a natural strongpoint, a treacherous limestone hill that provides a commanding view of the plains of County Tipperary. The Rock of Cashel is prominent in Irish folklore. According to legend, an angel appeared before two swineherds in the 5th century, telling them that whoever lit a fire atop Cashel Rock would be king of Munster. The pair hurried to give this information to Conall Cork, ancient ancestor of Maelmwad. Conall Cork quickly lit a fire atop the treacherous crag. 60 years later, St. Patrick arrived in Ireland. While baptising Angus, the king of Munster, St. Patrick's crozier accidentally pierced the foot of the king. Thinking it was all part of the ceremony, King Angus suffered in silence, a sign of the endurance and strength of Munster's warrior kings. Although the saint had not noticed that he'd wounded the king, the onlookers did, and Patrick wondered why no one else was willing to be baptised that day. When Patrick realised what had happened, he apologised, but Angus merely replied that no suffering could have prompted him to interrupt his reception of the sacrament. Patrick had baptised the King of Munster in blood. The Rock of Cashel had been anointed with the blood of the king. Mathgaman's triumph at Cashel Rock carried much symbolic and practical importance. Munster was one of Ireland's most important kingdoms, covering the entire southwest of the island, and its capture would have made the Dalgash a great power. But before Mathgaman could consolidate his victory, Maelmwad killed him and reclaimed Cashel. It was a critical political crisis for the Dalgash. Suddenly, Brian Boru found himself king of the Dalgash. His abilities were soon to be tested. Driven from Limerick in 972, Ivar made Scattery Island his new base of operations, near the mouth of the Shannon, an ideal launching point for attacks on the Dalgash. However, Brian Boru was about to put the lessons of Caesar into practice by beating Ivar at his own game. Having learned from the Vikings, Brian raised his own fleet, which he led to Scattery in 977. Taken by surprise, Ivar was defeated and slain in battle with Brian's troops. The following year, Brian took the fight to his brother's killer, defeating and killing Maelmwad. Brian Boru became King of Munster. Among the Irish and Vikings, many loathed to see the Dalgash triumph so completely. Brian's Irish enemies rallied around Donovan of the Efienti, who struck an alliance with the last of the Limerick Vikings, now led by Ivar's son, Harald. This Irish Viking coalition made its stand in County Limerick, facing the forces of Brian Boru. It was 978. At this critical battle of Cahercun, Brian Boru won a decisive victory. Both Donovan and Harald died in the fighting, and their coalition collapsed. Limerick became the key stronghold for the Dalgash. Though the Norse no longer held power there, many of them remained as mercenaries in the employ of Brian Boru, who valued them as fighters and sailors. Brian extended his power, becoming overlord of the traditionally Viking towns of Cork, Wexford and Waterford. He also took steps to assert his dominance over Connaught and Leinster. Brian's ambitious expansionism earned him the opposition of Mal Shacnal, the King of Meath and Overlord of Dublin, who gained the High Kingship in 980. Brian wouldn't back down. Nearly every year he raided Leinster, Meath or Connaught. He dispatched Viking fleets from Limerick to ravage the lands of his Irish enemies in Connaught and Meath along the River Shannon. With this powerful combination of land and naval attacks, Brian was proving to be the most effective general of his day. At last, Donchad mac Domhnall, the King of Leinster, submitted to Brian in 996. Then in 997, Brian achieved the ultimate prize. He forced Mal Shacnal, High King of Ireland, to recognise his power. Mal Shacnal would retain the High Kingship, though he would share power with Brian. Brian became the independent overlord of the entirety of the southern half of Ireland, including Dublin. In effect, Ireland now had two High Kings. But the fighting wasn't over. Donchad's successor for the throne of Leinster, Mal Morda, joined forces with Sitric Silkbeard in an alliance against Brian. Sitric was the son of the previously discussed Olaf Sitricsson, the Norse king of Dublin, by his Irish wife Gormflaith, daughter of the king of Leinster, Muchad mac Fin. The alliance between Silkbeard and Mal Morda truly represented a combined interest of both Irish and Norse dynasties. Sitric can hardly be considered a classic Viking invader. He was as Christian as Brian Boru, but both Sitric and Mal Morda believed Brian Boru to be the paramount threat to their power. In 999, Brian and Mal Shacnal led their two armies against Sitric and Mal Morda, trapping the rebels in a narrow pass and nearly annihilating them. Sitric was allowed to maintain his rule in Dublin, but he had to swear fealty to Brian. The victory further elevated Brian's status, who increasingly eclipsed the High King of Ireland. In 1002, Brian felt strong enough to take the High Kingship itself from Mal Shacnal. This humiliation earned Brian the undying enmity of Mal Shacnal. Secretly, the former High King contacted Sitric Silkbeard. The Leinster faction was also still keen to see Brian fall. Together, Brian's enemies planned and plotted their next move. Their goal was the total destruction of Brian Boru. Meanwhile, Brian himself had other ideas. In 1005, he made a pilgrimage to the holiest site in Ireland, St. Patrick's tomb at the monastery of Armagh. There, Brian placed 20 ounces of gold on the altar. He took a scribe to sign his name in the cathedral's record book, Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Irish. This was Brian's ultimate vision, to unite Ireland as a single kingdom, all ruled by a single king. Brian envisioned himself as that king. This, Brian's enemies were determined to prevent, and they gained substantial allies among Ireland's sub-kings, rattled by Boru's growing ambition. By 1014, Sitric Silkbeard and his allies felt strong enough to make their move. To improve his odds, Sitric summoned Viking forces from outside Ireland. Sigurd the Stout, Jarl of Orkney, and a Dane called Brodir arrived at Dublin with a considerable Norse force before Easter in 1014. Sigurd, a Viking in the classic sense, fought under the raven banner of Odin. Meanwhile, Brian assembled his vassals. He even had his own Viking allies. Brodir's own brother, Ospak of the Isle of Man, threw in his lot with Brian and led a Norse contingent under Boru's banner. The story of the brothers Brodir and Ospak, occasional allies, occasional enemies, is yet another intriguing thread in the annals of the Viking Age. Perhaps it's no surprise to find two Viking brothers each backing opposite sides in the definitive battle of medieval Ireland. The Battle of Clontarf is often viewed as the great moment when Brian Boru stood against Ireland's Viking invaders. Clearly, it was a far more complicated affair. Irish and Vikings figured prominently on both sides. Indeed, the blood of both Irish and Viking dynasties flowed through the veins of Sitric Silkbeard, who was perhaps more Celt than Norseman. Ultimately, Clontarf wasn't a battle to smash Viking power, it was a battle to determine who would be High King of Ireland. It was a clash of competing Irish interests, each of which made use of their own Viking allies. The site of the battle, Clontarf, was located a few miles north of Dublin. The two armies met there on April 23rd, 1014, Good Friday. Neither Sitrick nor Brian personally fought in the engagement. Sitrick remained with the garrison at Dublin, hoping to hold the town in case of a defeat. From Dublin's walls, he would observe the fighting. Even before the battle began, this didn't bode well for the rebels. Among some of his allies, Sitrick's absence could only be viewed as a loss of nerve. He may have even been attempting to adopt something of a neutral stance so that he could throw in with the winning side. Nevertheless, the remaining allies were still committed to the fight. Brian himself was now around 70 years old and too aged to personally join in the battle. He remained in his war tent. Brian's son and heir, Murchad, personally led his father's host. How large were the two armies? No one is sure. Some historians estimate that Brian had around 7,000 men, while the King of Leinster and his Norse allies had about 5,000. Whatever the case, there is some consensus among scholars that Brian probably had the bigger army. The size of Brian's army surely contributed to Sitrick's wariness. The battle opened rather formally, with two designated champions from each side engaging in single combat. Both men fell in this initial clash. Then the real battle began. The two armies fought mostly on foot. Each side stood shoulder to shoulder with their spears raised and their shields overlapping in the traditional shield wall formation. The opposing lines slammed into one another, slashing with swords or trying to stab above or under enemy shields. The outcome depended on who would break first. It was a grueling, exhausting form of combat. All day long the fighting continued. Still neither side broke. The rebels had far more at stake and fought with fierce energy. For a time, the Leinster coalition gained the advantage, pushing Brian's troops back. But as the battle raged on, Brian's army regained ground and drove their enemies to withdraw toward the bridge over the Liffey River. Two of Brian's grandsons fell in the fighting, but Brian's men caused the Vikings under Brothier to break and retreat. But Sigurd the Stout, personally waving his raven banner, rallied them back to the battle. This was a heroic gesture that appealed to the ancient instincts of the Vikings, who believed that victory would be attained by anyone holding the raven banner, though at the price of that holder's death. As the battle reached its climax, the sources describe a scene befitting the old sagas of the Norse. Brian's son, Murchad, sitting atop a white horse and wielding a sword in each hand, is said to have slain 100 men by his own blows. At last, Murchad confronted Sigurd personally. With one sword, Murchad dislodged Sigurd's helmet, while with his other sword, he sliced open Sigurd's throat. Sigurd fell dead at once, fulfilling, at least partially, the prophecy of the Raven Banner. However, one of Sigurd's Vikings drove his spear into Murchad's belly. Murchad collapsed, but before he died, he mustered the strength to pull off the Viking's mail coat, then stabbed the man 3 times in the chest. It's a magnificent, poetic scene. Did it truly happen just as described? We'll never know. Sigurd's death proved the turning point. The rebel shield wall broke. Brian Boru's army overran the field as their enemies fled in disorder. As with many medieval battles, most deaths came during the rout. Boru's troops cut down their opponents as they tried to flee. Many Norsemen drowned as they struggled to escape to their ships in the Dublin Bay. Amid this moment of triumph for Munster, Brothier and a small group of Vikings made it past enemy lines and entered Brian's tent, where the aged High King was praying. Most of the Vikings mistook this old man, kneeling and clinging to a cross, for a monk, but Brothier knew him instantly. With a single blow of his axe, Brothier split Brian's skull. Brian's troops quickly captured Brothier and his companions. Horrified at the sight of their slain king, the Irish warriors killed Brothier instantly, slicing open his belly, although some sources claim they kept him alive, only to torture him to death later. It was a dramatic climax to a bloody, horrific battle. Despite Brian's death, his army had triumphed. All Viking mercenaries taken prisoner were executed. Sihtric's last-minute wariness paid off. Dublin was spared. Casualties were horrendous on both sides. Brian's eldest son, as well as 2 grandsons, a nephew, brother, and many Irish nobles and clan leaders were slain. Hroðir's brother Ospak died as well. The Battle of Clontarf is essentially the classic Pyrrhic victory. The death of Brian and Murchad brought on the fall of Dalgash power. Brian's younger son took the throne, but he was a poor substitute for his father, and the empire collapsed. Boru's hard-won hegemony had vanished. Ultimately, it was the 2 leaders who kept aloof that triumphed. Maelsechnaill regained the High Kingship, and Sihtric remained in control of Dublin. Sihtric had survived the great struggle between competing High Kings and Irish dynasties. His position remained largely unchanged. He was still the client of the High King, if a different High King. Dublin, dominated by the Kingdom of Leinster, was no longer a centre of power in Ireland, but it remained the island's most important port. It certainly was no longer a Viking town. Trade passing through Dublin increased Sihtric's wealth. In 1029, he paid an enormous ransom to free his son Olaf from the custody of the King of Brega, paying 1,200 cows, 120 ponies, 60 ounces of gold and 60 ounces of silver. He rewarded the man who'd conducted the negotiations with 80 cattle. The descendant of Viking raiders was now a rich, well-situated Irish sub-king. In 1028, he travelled as a pilgrim to Rome. By all accounts, he was a sincere Christian who sought forgiveness for his sins at the centre of the Latin Christian world. On returning, he founded Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin.
Sihtric's end wasn't peaceful. In 1035, another Norse Gaelic ruler, Ecmarkov mac Ragnail of the Hebrides, conquered Dublin and drove Sihtric into exile. Sihtric died in 1042, most likely while traveling on another pilgrimage to Rome. For the next century, Dublin was battled over by various Irish kings. At times, Norsemen would again gain control of the town. But they were different. For all the change that the Vikings had brought to Ireland, Ireland had profoundly changed the Vikings who'd come to it. By the 11th century, the Norsemen of Ireland were no longer Vikings as we often imagine them. They spoke Gaelic, practiced Christianity, and were mostly now of mixed Irish and Norse ancestry. Old pagan funerary rites were gone, replaced by Christian practices. The Norse hadn't lost their skill at sea, and their fleets remained valued among Ireland's kings. But at this point, it becomes difficult to tell where Irish and Norse begin and end. The Norsemen who'd continued to live in Ireland now had their own identity. In England, they were known as Ostmen, men of the East, that is, Eastern Ireland. So abroad, the Norse Irish were recognized as distinct from other Scandinavians. This was the final result of those first Viking attacks on Ireland's monasteries back in the tumultuous days of the 8th and 9th centuries. Ireland's Viking legacy, as Lars Brownworth points out, is a tangled one. The Norse established Ireland's great commercial cities, Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Wexford, and Waterford. But their reputation as brutal raiders was well earned. They brought much destruction to an Irish civilization in its prime. Countless Irish men, women, and children died in the violence of the period, and countless more ended their lives in slavery, victims of the notorious slave trade brought to the island by the Vikings. This slave trade took many Irish victims to misery in distant places, since the most favored markets of the Norse were the wealthy Byzantine and Muslim cities of the south and east. Slavery had been a part of Ireland during the age of St. Patrick, but it had died out. It was the Vikings who reintroduced it. And the slave trade thrived in post-Viking Ireland. The church condemned it, recalling St. Patrick's suffering as a slave. By 1171, when English armies seized power in Ireland, one Irish cleric proclaimed that God had sent the English to end the slave trade. This is a debatable conclusion, of course, since plenty of Irish during the period viewed the English presence as oppressive. But the fact that one Irish cleric made this comment is significant and interesting. Perhaps Dublin is the most positive legacy of the Viking era. Its growth continued, and by the High Middle Ages it was well known for its luxury goods. Gold, silver, weapons, silks, and horses were all traded at Dublin, and merchants flocked to the port from far and wide. Indeed, it was the Norse who'd brought coinage to Dublin in the first place. The city was truly one of Christendom's international hubs. Dublin produced Ireland's first class of Irish merchants. The early 11th century was a time when the Viking Age was at an end throughout northwestern Europe, in part because the Vikings themselves had adapted so well to the territories they'd invaded. Christianity had spread across Scandinavia. By the early 12th century, the King of Norway would be the crusader Sigurd I, who sailed with a fleet of Christian Norsemen to aid King Baldwin of Jerusalem in his crusade against the Turks. Together, Baldwin and Sigurd would visit the River Jordan, the site of the baptism of Jesus Christ. It's remarkable to find a Norse seafarer venerating Christ in the land of his birth and death alongside a crusading king. The changes that had taken place in Ireland were similar to changes that had spread across the whole of the old Viking world. The 11th century would prove to be a momentous period in European history. Latin Christendom emerged as a rising power in the Mediterranean world. Populations were growing from Italy to England, wealth was increasing, and military power was on the rise in the kingdoms of the Latin West. These changes impacted Ireland as well. The Vikings had brought a great deal of that change. Their violence and brutality hardened the military and political organizations of the Irish, and their relentless wandering brought increased trade. But perhaps it was the Norse themselves who experienced the most change. By the mid-12th century, they had all but vanished as a distinct group in Ireland, absorbed into the Irish. When the Anglo-Normans arrived to conquer Ireland in the mid-1100s, the Vikings were all but gone. What was left was the new Ireland that they'd helped create. Thanks for watching. Now, check out our full-length documentary on the life of Charlemagne, the great founding emperor of medieval Europe. Click on the video linked on your screen right now to watch. Click on the link to our Patreon to support our work, ask me questions, and get exclusive behind-the-scenes content.